trauma work and understanding trauma is so immensely important on the healing journey. We cannot really liberate ourselves or even evolve spiritually if we don't have a functional understanding of trauma. There's a divine reason for trauma. And if we can understand it, if we can understand why this happens to us, and then how to actually work with it, we can totally and radically transform our lives and other people's lives. This is not necessarily complex. Trauma is not scary. It's super easy to understand. It's really easy to hold space for once you know what to do. So let's go back to the meta view of why we did this to ourselves. I want to zoom out for a minute and actually give you a meta perspective of why we get traumatized in the first place. So on the metaphysical level, before we became human beings, before we became anything, we were light. We call this consciousness, source, God, energy, whatever you want to call it. At the beginning of time, there was just this one thing. It wasn't even a thing. There was no things. It was just source. Let's call it source energy. One of the ways I teach this sometimes is I say, think about it like it was the sun. But the sun was the only thing that existed. There was nothing else. And the sun knew that it was the sun, but it didn't know what it felt like to be the sun because there was nothing to compare it to. Imagine if there was just heat, which you couldn't even call heat, right? And it gets very complex at this level to talk about because you need contrast to actually have these conversations. But imagine that there's just one thing, and because there's no contrast, there's no way for that one thing to know what it feels like to be that one thing. So a lot of metaphysical texts and spiritual texts, Conversations with God, Course in Miracles, all of these books talk about the fact that the universe wanted to know what it felt like to be itself. It wanted to know what it felt like to be light, to be love, to be consciousness. And because there was nothing to compare itself to, you kind of have to think about it like this. Imagine that there was one thing, and through a series of phenomenal events, no idea how this happened, so brilliant, it's like there was an explosion of parts within oneness. So within inside of oneness, we now have planets and galaxies and stars and all the other bits and pieces that make up everything inside of oneness. Now, one part of inside of oneness is planet Earth. That is a part inside of oneness. And then on planet Earth, there are people who are born, including you. You were born as a baby on planet Earth as a part of consciousness within inside of oneness. Not separate from it, inside of it, part of it. And visually, everything's connected. It's like everything's extensions of source, out of source. From the planets to the people to children to everything is just connected. If anyone's had any experience with some really deep meditations where you see everything's energetically connected, or you've worked with some plant medicines, you actually visually see that energetically there is no separation between anything. And so here you are as a baby inside of oneness on planet Earth. Now, when you come in, you are pretty much a blank canvas. As a baby, you're a blank canvas. Yes, the wisdom of the universe is inside the DNA of your cells, but it's pretty much dormant when you begin. And you bring a lot of things. We're not going to have the conversation about past or parallel lives here, but there is a lot of information that you do bring with you inside of your DNA. Whether you believe in past lives or not actually doesn't matter. My mom does not believe in past lives or reincarnation, but she said that she can understand, because we have these conversations, that we're all connected. Because we're all connected, she understands that we can bring information from the generations before us, and that within inside of the cells that we do have information from all areas of the universe, the microcosm within the macrocosm. So it doesn't really matter what the belief system is. We come in with the information inside of ourselves, but as we are born, our consciousness is basically a blank canvas. So in the first couple of years of life, between ages 0 and 8, and this is highly understood within the field of psychology and accepted, that's really where the majority of our conditioning is happening. Now, that conditioning is us learning about who we are through the reflections and relationships of the people that we have been born into. And so we are learning about ourselves as an identity, as a boy, as a girl, as a good boy, as a good girl, as a bad boy, as a bad girl, as a separate identity within inside of the social construct. But if we're looking at the human experience, not the spiritual experience, yes, oneness is complete and whole as it is, but as a human being, we have needs. Those needs are absolutely integral to our human experience. The major needs that I'm going to talk about here are the need for love and connection, validation or significance, and safety, security, and control. I'm going to put them in those categories for now. Can expand into more categories, and I'm mixing a few things here, but I'm just going to give you those ones for now. Love and connection, validation and significance, and then security or control, safety. If you think you're just source consciousness and that source consciousness doesn't need anything and that a baby comes in just as source consciousness, then technically all the needs of that baby should be totally met just from that baby being a baby. But here's the thing, if you leave a baby after it gets born and you provide it with its food and its shelter and all of its survival needs, but you do not look that baby in the eyes or touch it, within a couple of months that baby will die. That has been proven. They've already done experiments on that, not that they probably should have, but they wanted to see what would happen to orphan children if they were not looked at in the eye or physically touched in the first couple of years of their life, even if all their needs were met and they started to die. That is how wired we are for needing love and connection in this world. Here's another example. Homeless community. One of the deepest pains of the people who live in the homeless community or live on the streets is not that their needs aren't being, it's not that their survival is a threat. That's one thing that's very challenging. It's that people treat them like they're invisible. If you actually talk to those people, one of the deepest pains is not starvation for food. It is the starvation for significance and connection. Mother Teresa talked about this a lot. She worked in Vancouver with immense poverty, starvation, multiple people dying. And she said, we don't have a pandemic of starvation for food. We have a pandemic for starvation of connection. That's what's happening here. The deepest pain of the people who are dying on the streets in Vancouver was that people weren't validating that they even existed. There was no love and connection. So we need these things. These are our basic human needs. Now, of course, as we get older and we start to walk a spiritual path, we actually learn how to meet those needs ourselves. And we can actually fulfill those needs ourselves from the relationship that we have with ourselves internally. As a baby, we need that from the people around us. We need that from our primary caregivers. We need it from whoever is bringing us up. So, trauma. Trauma is a moment in which a baby, usually in the first 1 to 8 years of life, experiences something emotional, an emotional experience that they can't process adequately because they don't have the resources in that moment. It is always the loss of one of those human needs. It is a threat to one of those human needs at the same time. So I'll give you an example. If a baby or a young child says no, let's just say in their own way, they throw a tantrum, and the tantrum is a way to say no, this is a no for me. But the parent says, I'm not going to honor your no, and I'm going to force you to do it anyway, and I'm going to do it through punishing you somehow. So you have to do the thing that I'm telling you to do because I'm going to punish you if you don't do it. That baby very quickly learns that no is not okay. And so they suppress the part of them that says no, and they might become a yes baby or a yes child. Because basically what their parent has said is, if you don't say yes to what I'm doing, I'm either going to take away love and connection, validation or significance, or I'm going to take away your safety, your feeling of security with me. And this is very, very easy to do. Emotions get punished as children. This is one of the biggest things that kind of set us up for a lot of pain in our adult life. I'm going to tell you why we do this too, so that you can understand. Let's say that as a child, you express anger, and you have parents who have decided, because of their upbringing, anger is not good. Anger is bad. So when you get angry, maybe you get put in the room by yourself and you get isolated and said, you go into timeout until you stop being angry. So whilst you're sitting in timeout, you've just been taught, I lose connection because I've just been isolated, or I lose my safety from my primary caregiver or validation, whatever it is for that child. And now I'm sitting isolated, punished for an emotion. And I need to start to learn about what's happening. And very quickly, because we're geared for survival, and that's a good thing, we start saying to ourselves in isolation, I shouldn't be angry. Anger is something that causes a loss of connection, a loss of safety. And so now I'm going to take the angry part of myself and I'm going to hide that in my subconscious, and I'm going to start to push that away. Some people do this. A lot of babies do this. Something else also happens in this moment that is very, very important to understand. When a child is punished for an emotion, and that child doesn't know that anything is wrong with an emotion, because children don't know. Emotions aren't wrong. It is all conditioned, right? Child doesn't know anger is wrong. Child doesn't know jealousy is wrong. A baby doesn't know that hitting its sister is wrong. Or being, not even hitting, but let's say it doesn't know that feeling jealous and the jealousy turning into some sort of behavior, the child doesn't know that's wrong. So they're sitting, being punished for the emotion, learning that the emotion is bad, learning that the emotion is going to take away one of their basic human needs. And also it's very easy in the psyche of a young person to think, well, if my parents are punishing me for this, then something must be wrong with me. Hello, core wounding. Something is wrong with me. I'm not good enough. So children learn very quickly to place a lot of very deep core wounds inside of their psyche because of the relationships with their parents. So actually, I want you to imagine trauma to be like this. Imagine that you're a child and a trauma is like a meteorite of emotion. It comes in and hits you. You can't adequately understand, and so it fragments you into parts. It's like it shatters your consciousness. And those shattered pieces of your consciousness are different aspects of yourself. Now, that may be the part that says yes, the part that says no, the part that feels worthy, the part that doesn't feel worthy, the part that gets angry, and the part that doesn't get angry. So you shatter into these polarities. And inside of that trauma moment, you learn very quickly what parts of you are acceptable and what parts aren't acceptable, what parts are going to get your needs met and what parts aren't. And so you push to the forefront the parts of you that you think are going to get your needs met and keep you safe, and you push into your subconscious the parts that you think are dangerous and not good. And so I want you to imagine that as you're growing up in these childhood moments, every trauma is like a shatter, and it's a frozen moment. We'll come back to that, but it shatters your consciousness. You do a bunch of things inside of your psyche, and it also freezes that moment in time. One of the reasons that we freeze these moments in time is that when you're 2 years old, and this is an amazing thing. I said I'm going to circle back around to why we do this. I'll come back to this. But as a 2-year-old, you may experience something that a 2-year-old really can't deal with. And so that shattered consciousness and that frozen moment, it's like the child takes the memory and then stores a lot of that inside of your body and says, I'm going to come back to that when I'm old enough and can actually deal with it. Because at 2 years old, I don't have the skills and the resources. So I'm going to start freezing moments in time and hiding them in my consciousness so that when I'm actually capable, when I've grown up to the point where I have enough emotional understanding and resilience and capacity in my psychology to actually turn around and go back and unfreeze these moments, then you'll do it then. And by the way, this moment now. Congratulations. This is exactly what's happened. Back to creation story. Oneness wanted to experience itself as itself. It recognized that you couldn't have experiences of yourself if you didn't have contrast. When you shatter yourself into parts, and the parts go into dual experiences, the good, the bad, the worthy, the unworthy, you now have contrast within your psyche. You now have the dualistic experiences of yourself in parts, which means that the universe had to fragment itself into parts. Your consciousness had to fragment itself into parts in order to eventually find those parts, heal those parts, bring those parts back to oneness so that you could have an experience of becoming oneness, so that you could have an experience of coming back together. And actually this coming back together is what love feels like. If we didn't have trauma, if we didn't have a way to fragment ourselves, if we didn't have a way to shatter ourselves into dualistic parts and to experience contrast through this shattering, how on earth were we ever going to find ourselves, integrate ourselves, and come back to a feeling of wholeness and completeness and love? Welcome to the solution of the universe to how to experience yourself as oneness.